The letter had traveled nearly 2,000 miles, crossing territories and states, before arriving in Florence Reed's trembling hands on a crisp October morning in 1876. Standing on the porch of her modest Boston boarding house, Florence stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of her future in the ink-stained paper. 2 black mourning bands still circled her sleeves, one for each husband lost, the first to pneumonia barely a month after the wedding, the second to a logging accident before they'd even celebrated their half-year anniversary. Now at 26, with whispers of black widow and cursed bride following her through the narrow streets of Boston, Florence had placed an advertisement in the Western Matrimonial News as her final hope. "You've another letter, Miss Reed," said Mrs. Holcomb, the landlady, eyeing Florence with the same mixture of pity and suspicion that had become unbearable these past months. "Another suitor from out west, is it?" Florence nodded, clutching the envelope to her chest. "Yes, from Wyoming Territory, a cattle rancher outside Laramie." She didn't add that this was the only reply she'd received after 3 months of waiting. Word of her unfortunate history had spread further than she'd imagined. Inside her small room, Florence sat on the edge of her bed and carefully opened the letter. The handwriting was strong and purposeful, without flourish a practical man's script. "Miss Reed, your advertisement caught my interest. I own a cattle ranch 10 miles west of Laramie, Wyoming Territory. It is 800 acres with a sturdy 2-story house. I seek a woman of good character who isn't afraid of hard work and solitude. I am 30 years old, never married. I can provide comfort but not luxury. I understand your past circumstances. They do not concern me. Death is part of life out here. If you are agreeable, I will send train fare. You may have a month to decide if this arrangement suits you. If not, I ask only that you repay the fare before returning east. Respectfully, Forrest Rivers." Florence read the letter 3 times. It was direct, almost blunt, but something in its straightforward honesty appealed to her. He hadn't flinched at her past. "They do not concern me," he'd written. 7 simple words that offered more understanding than she'd found in all of Boston. 2 weeks later, Florence boarded a westbound train with everything she owned packed in one trunk and one carpet bag. She'd sold her mother's silver and her own wedding rings to afford proper clothing for ranch life. 3 sturdy cotton dresses, 2 woolen skirts, practical undergarments, and a pair of leather boots more substantial than any she'd owned before. The journey west seemed endless. Florence watched as the dense forests and tidy towns of the east gave way to vast, rolling prairies that stretched to horizons she could scarcely comprehend. Each mile carried her further from the life she had known, from the graves of 2 men whose names she had briefly carried, and from the whispers that had driven her to this desperate choice. In Cheyenne, she changed to a smaller train for the final leg to Laramie. A woman across the aisle, noticing Florence's plain dark traveling dress and nervous expression, leaned over. "Heading to Laramie alone, dear? Not many young ladies travel these parts unescorted." Florence nodded politely. "Yes, I'm to be married." The woman's face brightened. "A mail-order bride." "How exciting! Who's the lucky fellow?" "Mr. Forrest Rivers. He has a cattle ranch outside of town." The woman's expression changed subtly, her smile faltering. "Rivers, you say? The one west of town near Whiskey Creek?" "I believe so. Do you know him?" The woman lowered her voice. "Only by reputation, dear. Keeps to himself, that one. They say he's a bit odd, doesn't come to town except for supplies, never attends church or socials." She paused, studying Florence's face. "You're from back east, aren't you? Have you been married before?" Florence stiffened. "Twice, actually." "I've been widowed twice." The woman's eyes widened and she made a small, involuntary movement as if putting distance between them. "Twice? My goodness, how unfortunate." "Yes," Florence said flatly, "quite unfortunate." The woman fell silent, but Florence could feel her gaze throughout the remainder of the journey. The whispers had followed her even here, before she'd even arrived. Laramie Station was little more than a wooden platform beside a cluster of buildings that constituted the town. As passengers disembarked, Florence stood uncertainly beside her trunk, scanning the small crowd for a man who might be Forrest Rivers. She'd sent no photograph, and he'd requested none in return. A tall man in a worn duster approached, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He stopped a few feet from her, studying her with keen eyes the color of a winter sky. "Miss Reed?" His voice was deep and quiet. "Yes." "Mr. Rivers," he nodded once, then removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested squinting across great distances rather than laughter. "Welcome to Wyoming." He glanced at her trunk. "Is this all your belongings?" "Yes, I travel light." Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. "Good. It's a long ride to the ranch." He signaled to a boy loitering nearby. "Billy, load this lady's trunk into my wagon, will you?" As the boy hurried to comply, Forrest turned back to Florence. "You'll want to visit the general store before we leave town. The journey's about 2 hours, and there's nothing between here and the ranch." Florence nodded, suddenly tongue-tied in the presence of this stranger who might become her husband. She'd expected awkwardness, of course, but the reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. She'd traveled thousands of miles to marry a man she knew only through a single letter. The general store was crowded with ranchers and townspeople stocking up on supplies. Florence felt the curious stares as she entered with Forrest. A stout woman behind the counter eyed her speculatively. "This must be your mail-order bride, Rivers," she said with surprising directness. "We'd begun to think you'd never take a wife." Forrest merely nodded, not bothering with introductions. "We need some supplies, Mrs. Holden." The woman ignored him, focusing on Florence instead. "Welcome to Laramie, dear. I'm Edith Holden. My husband and I run this store." Her gaze traveled over Florence's black-trimmed clothing. "You're in mourning." "Yes," Florence said simply. "Her personal matters are her own concern," Forrest interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "We'll take 5 pounds of coffee, a sack of flour, sugar, and whatever fruits you've got that aren't spoiled. Mrs." Holden's lips tightened at his brusqueness, but she began gathering the requested items. As she worked, Florence noticed her whispering to another customer, both women glancing in her direction. Forrest noticed too. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "Town's got little to talk about besides other people's business." "I'm used to being discussed," Florence replied, straightening her shoulders. "Though I'd hoped it might be different here. People talk everywhere," Forrest said matter-of-factly. "Doesn't mean you have to listen." Outside, he helped her into a sturdy wagon already loaded with supplies. As they pulled away from the bustling Main Street, Florence caught fragments of conversation from 2 men on the boardwalk. "That's her Rivers mail-order bride. Heard she buried 2 husbands already. They're calling her the Black Widow back east. Rivers either doesn't know or doesn't care. Fool's taking a big risk. She's bad luck, mark my words." Florence's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze fixed forward as Forrest snapped the reins, urging the horses into a trot. They rode in silence until the town disappeared behind them and there was nothing but rolling grassland and distant mountains. "I should tell you," Florence said finally, her voice small against the vastness surrounding them. "What they're saying is true. I was married twice before. Both my husbands died within months of our weddings." Forrest kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "I know, you mentioned it in your letter. People say I'm cursed, that I bring bad luck. People say a lot of things." He glanced at her briefly. "I don't put stock in superstition, Miss Reed. Men die out here from 100 different causes. Sickness, accidents, Indian attacks, barroom brawls. Living is the exception, not dying." His bluntness was oddly comforting. Florence studied his profile, the strong jaw and straight nose, the lines that time and hardship had etched into his skin. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way her previous husbands had been, but there was something compelling in his self-contained strength. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" she asked suddenly. There must have been others without my history. Forrest was quiet for so long that Florence thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Your letter was honest. You didn't try to paint yourself as something you weren't. Most women write about their cooking skills or how obedient they'll be. You wrote about wanting a fresh start, about being willing to work hard for it." He adjusted his grip on the reins. "I respect honesty and hard work. The rest is just talk." As they traveled west, the landscape grew wilder. They followed a creek that Forrest identified as Whiskey Creek, named, he explained, after a group of trappers who'd frozen to death there after drinking their last bottle of whiskey during a blizzard decades earlier. "Cheerful story," Florence remarked dryly. The corner of Forrest's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Welcome to Wyoming territory. It was nearly sunset when they crested a small rise, and Florence got her first glimpse of what might become her home. The ranch house stood in a small valley, with a barn and several outbuildings clustered nearby. Behind them rose the foothills that eventually became mountains, their peaks already dusted with early snow. A stream, a tributary of Whiskey Creek, Forrest explained, ran through the property, providing water for the cattle that dotted the surrounding pastures. The house itself was larger than Florence had expected, a two-story structure built of timber and river stone with a broad porch wrapping around two sides. Smoke rose from the chimney and light glowed from the windows. "Someone's there," Florence said, surprised. "My ranch hand, Gabriel. He lives in a cabin behind the barn, but he would have started the fire when he saw us coming." As they pulled up to the house, a weathered man in his 50s emerged from the barn. He approached the wagon, nodding respectfully to Florence. "Got everything ready inside, boss," he said to Forrest. "Stew's on the stove." "Thank you, Gabriel. This is Miss Reed." Gabriel touched the brim of his hat. "Madam, hope the journey wasn't too tiring." "It was long but interesting," Florence replied with a smile. "I've never seen country like this before." "Takes some getting used to," Gabriel agreed. "All this open space makes some folks nervous. Others can't imagine living any other way once they've tried it." He turned to Forrest. "I'll take care of the horses and bring in the lady's trunk." Forrest helped Florence down from the wagon, his hand strong and steady around hers. At the door, he hesitated. "It's not fancy," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice for the first time. "But it's solid. Built it myself with Gabriel's help." Inside, Florence found herself in a large room that served as both kitchen and living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cookstove opposite. The furniture was simple but well-crafted: a pine table with 6 chairs, a sofa covered in faded but clean fabric, several shelves filled with books that surprised her. A staircase led to the second floor. "It's lovely," she said, and meant it. The space was practical but comfortable and far more refined than she'd expected from a bachelor rancher. "Your room is upstairs," Forrest said, suddenly formal. "The first door on the right. There's a washroom between our bedrooms with a pump bringing water from the creek. I'll bring up your trunk once Gabriel brings it in." Florence looked at him in surprise. "Our bedrooms," a flush crept up Forrest's neck. "I meant what I wrote, Miss Reed. You have a month to decide if this arrangement suits you. Until then, we'll maintain proper distance." He gestured toward the stove. "Are you hungry? Gabriel makes a decent stew." Later, after a simple but satisfying meal eaten mostly in silence, Florence stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the alien landscape now bathed in moonlight. The vastness of it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Back in Boston, buildings hemmed in the view from every window. Here she could see for miles, all the way to mountains that seemed impossibly distant. She'd expected to feel lonely, but instead she felt something closer to peace. Forrest Rivers was unlike any man she'd known: taciturn where her first husband had been loquacious, steady where her second had been impulsive. He carried none of the easy charm that had drawn her before, but there was a quiet dignity in his manner that compelled her respect. Whether she could build a life with him, whether she even wanted to remain to be seen. But for the first time since she'd stood beside her second husband's grave, Florence felt something like hope stirring in her chest. Morning came with golden light streaming through the uncurtained window, and the unfamiliar sounds of a working ranch, the lowing of cattle, the nickering of horses, men's voices calling to each other. Florence dressed quickly in one of her sturdier dresses and made her way downstairs to find Forrest already gone and Gabriel setting a pot of coffee and a plate of biscuits on the table. "Boss is checking the north pasture," he explained. "Said to tell you to make yourself at home, explore as you like. Just don't go beyond the creek alone, sometimes we get mountain lions coming down for water." Florence poured herself coffee. "How long have you worked for Mr. Rivers?" "Going on 15 years now. Was with his pa before him." "His father is deceased," Gabriel nodded, spooning honey onto a biscuit. 5 years ago. His ma passed when Forrest was just a boy. It was just the two of them for a long while. No siblings, had a brother, younger by 2 years, died in the war." Florence absorbed this. "Mr. Rivers seems very self-contained," Gabriel chuckled. "That's one way of putting it. He's not much for talk, but he's a good man, fair, treats his hands well, works harder than any of us." He studied her. "He's been alone too long, if you ask me. Place like this needs a woman's touch." After breakfast, Florence explored the house more thoroughly. The second bedroom upstairs was clearly Forrest's, sparsely furnished but meticulously neat, with a bookshelf holding volumes on cattle breeding, botany, and surprisingly, poetry. The third room appeared to be a study, with a desk covered in ledgers and maps. Downstairs, beyond the main room, she found a small parlor with a piano that looked as if it hadn't been played in years. Dust covers protected most of the furniture, but when Florence lifted one, she discovered a delicate settee upholstered in faded blue silk, a genteel piece that seemed out of place in this frontier home. "It was his mother's," said a voice behind her. Florence turned to find Forrest in the doorway, hat in hand. He'd clearly just returned, his boots still dusty from the trail. "I didn't mean to pry," she said quickly. "It's not prying. This is your home now, or it could be." He entered the room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time in a long while. "My mother came from Philadelphia. My father built this house for her. The piano and furniture came by wagon train, cost a fortune to transport it all." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She said she'd go mad without some civilization around her." "Did she? Go mad, I mean." "No, she thrived here, actually. Taught me and my brother to play piano, to appreciate Shakespeare and Wordsworth. Made sure we spoke properly, not like the cowhands." His expression softened with memory. "She died of fever when I was 12. My father never moved anything in this room afterward." "I'm sorry," Florence said quietly. "Gabriel mentioned you lost your brother too." Forrest nodded, his face closing again. "Union cavalry, Antietam." He looked directly at her then. "I know about loss, Miss Reed. We all carry our dead with us." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. For the first time, Florence felt she might have found someone who wouldn't flinch from her history, who might even understand the weight she carried. "Please," she said, "call me Florence." That evening after dinner, as Forrest checked his ledgers at the kitchen table and Florence mended a tear in one of her traveling dresses, she found the courage to ask more about the ranch. "How many cattle do you run?" Forrest looked up, seemingly surprised by her interest. "About 800 head, mostly Herefords. They handle the winters better than most breeds." "And the land?" Gabriel mentioned a north pasture. 800 acres. We graze different sections in rotation to prevent overgrazing. The north pasture has the best grass in summer, but it's too exposed in winter, so we move the herd south when the cold weather comes." Florence nodded, thinking. "And crops? Do you grow anything besides grass for the cattle? Some corn? Hay, kitchen garden behind the house for vegetables." "Why do you ask?" "I'm trying to understand what life here would entail if I stay." She set her mending aside. "What would my duties be as your wife?" Forrest considered her question with the same seriousness he seemed to give every matter. "The house, of course." "Cooking, though Gabriel's been handling that. We have a woman from town who comes once a month to help with laundry and deeper cleaning. He hesitated. Children eventually, if we're so blessed. Florence felt her cheeks warm, and nothing with the cattle or the business side of things. Forrest raised an eyebrow. Do you have experience with either? No, she admitted, but I'm quick to learn. My first husband was an accountant. I helped with his books, and my father was a merchant. I worked in his shop until I married. Forrest studied her with new interest. Most women wouldn't want involvement in such matters. I'm not most women, Mr. Rivers. No, he agreed quietly. I'm beginning to see that. Over the next week, Florence settled into a routine. She took over the cooking from Gabriel, who seemed relieved to relinquish the duty. She cleaned the neglected parlor, tuned the piano as best she could, and planted bulbs in the dormant flower beds flanking the porch, looking forward to spring blooms. Each evening, she and Forrest would eat together, their conversations gradually lengthening as Florence's questions about the ranch drew him out of his habitual reserve. On Sunday, Forrest surprised her by asking if she'd like to attend church in Laramie. Gabriel mentioned you never go to town for social occasions, Florence said. Forrest shrugged. I thought you might appreciate the opportunity. The small church was packed when they arrived, and Florence felt the curious stares as Forrest led her to a pew near the back. During the hymns, she was startled to hear his deep voice joining in. He knew all the words without looking at the hymnal. After the service, several women approached, introducing themselves with the barely concealed curiosity of those meeting a potential new neighbor. We're so pleased to meet you, Miss Reed, said an older woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Thornton. We were quite surprised when we heard Forrest Rivers had sent for a bride. He's kept to himself since returning from the war. I understand you were widowed, said another woman, Mrs. Caldwell. Twice, wasn't it? How tragic. There was no hiding the gossip. Florence realized. It had already circulated throughout the small community. Yes, she acknowledged. My first husband died of pneumonia shortly after our wedding, my second in a logging accident. How unfortunate, Mrs. Caldwell said, her tone suggesting something beyond simple sympathy. Some might consider it an ill omen. Some might, Florence agreed steadily. But I don't believe in omens, Mrs. Caldwell, only in God's will and human choices. Before the woman could respond, Forrest appeared at Florence's side, his presence somehow protective without being possessive. Ladies, he nodded to the women. If you'll excuse us, we should start back. Weather's turning. As they drove home, dark clouds gathered on the western horizon. Florence watched them warily. Will it be a bad storm? Forrest assessed the sky with a practiced eye. Not too bad, early season, but we'll need to hurry to beat it home. They didn't quite succeed. The first heavy drops began to fall when they were still 20 minutes from the ranch, and within minutes, it had become a downpour. By the time they reached the house, both were soaked through despite Forrest's duster, which he'd wrapped around Florence's shoulders. Inside, Forrest built up the fire while Florence changed into dry clothes upstairs. When she returned to the kitchen, she found him still in his wet shirt, setting a kettle to boil. You should change, she admonished. You'll catch your death. The words hung between them, Florence suddenly aware of their implication given her history. But Forrest only nodded and headed upstairs, returning minutes later in a dry flannel shirt, his hair still damp. I thought we might have tea, he said, gesturing to the kettle, to ward off the chill. They sat before the fire with steaming cups, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Outside, the world had turned gray, the mountains invisible behind curtains of water. What did you think of our little church? Forrest asked after a comfortable silence. It was lovely, the people were. Florence searched for a diplomatic word. Nosy, Forrest supplied, a hint of amusement in his voice. Florence laughed, the sound surprising her. How long had it been since she'd laughed freely? Yes, rather, but I suppose that's to be expected in a small community. They'll talk about us regardless, might as well give them something worth talking about. Is that why you never go to town? To avoid the gossip? Forrest's expression grew thoughtful. Partly. After the war, I didn't have much patience for small talk and social niceties. Found it easier to keep to myself. He looked at her directly. What about you? How are you finding the isolation here? Florence considered the question seriously. It's different. In Boston, I was surrounded by people but still felt isolated. Here, there are fewer people, but I don't feel quite so alone. She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. Though I miss certain things, books, music, conversation. We have books, Forrest pointed out, and a piano that hasn't been played in years. As for conversation, he hesitated. I'm not much good at it, but I'm willing to try. The simple admission touched Florence deeply. Here was a man admitting a weakness, offering to work at it for her. Tell me about your brother, she said gently, if you don't mind speaking of him. Forrest stared into the fire for a long moment. Franklin was 2 years younger, looked just like our mother, fair hair, blue eyes, quick to laugh, quick to anger, brilliant with horses, could gentle the wildest Mustang. His voice grew softer. When the war came, I was managing the ranch with our father. Franklin insisted on enlisting. Said it was his duty. He took a deep breath. Never came home. They buried him on some field in Maryland. Florence reached across the space between them, resting her hand lightly on his. I'm sorry. Forrest looked down at her hand on his, then slowly turned his palm upward, his fingers curling around hers. It was the first time he'd initiated any physical contact beyond helping her into the wagon. What about you? He asked. Tell me about your husbands. Florence withdrew her hand, surprised by the request. No one had ever asked her to speak of them. People were too uncomfortable, too afraid of inviting bad luck by association. My first husband, Thomas, was an accountant for a shipping firm. We met at church. He was kind, talkative, always planning for the future. She smiled sadly. We'd been married 3 weeks when he developed a cough. Within a month, he was gone. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though it happened so quickly. She twisted her hands in her lap. My second husband, James, was different. A lumberman, strong, adventurous. We married 6 months after Thomas died, too soon, perhaps, but I was lonely. 4 months later, a log rolled the wrong way. They brought him home broken beyond repair. Forrest listened without interruption, his face compassionate but not pitying. When she finished, he asked simply, Did you love them? The question startled her with its directness. I thought I did. I certainly cared for them deeply, but we had so little time together. She looked up at him. I sometimes wonder if I ever really knew either of them, or if they knew me. Outside, the storm was passing, the rain softening to a gentle patter. The fire had burned low, casting the room in a warm glow that made the moment feel intimate, suspended in time. And now you're here, Forrest said quietly, with a stranger. Not quite a stranger anymore, Florence replied, surprising herself with her honesty. But yes, it's a risk for both of us. Life is risk, he said simply, especially out here. The following day dawned clear and cool, the storm having washed the world clean. Florence woke early and was surprised to find Forrest already in the kitchen, frying bacon and brewing coffee. I thought I'd do the cooking, she said, watching him flip the bacon with practiced ease. You were tired from yesterday's journey, thought you might appreciate sleeping in. He slid a plate of bacon and eggs in front of her. Besides, I've been cooking for myself for years. I'm not entirely helpless in a kitchen. Florence tasted the eggs. These are good. Better than mine, actually. A smile ghosted across Forrest's face. Don't tell Gabriel. He's been complaining about my cooking for years. After breakfast, Forrest surprised her again. I need to check the South Range today. Would you like to come along? I could show you more of the property. Florence accepted eagerly, changing into her sturdiest dress and boots. Outside, she found Forrest waiting not with the wagon but with 2 saddled horses. Do you ride? He asked, seeing her hesitation. Not since I was a girl and never very well. Daisy here is gentle as they come, he said, patting the dun mare's neck. We'll take it slow. With Forrest's help, Florence mounted, feeling precarious at first but gradually relaxing as the mare plodded docilely behind Forrest's gelding. They rode south, crossing the creek at a shallow ford, then climbing a gentle slope that offered a sweeping view of the ranch. It's beautiful, Florence said, genuinely moved by the landscape. The mountains provided a majestic backdrop to rolling grasslands dotted with grazing cattle. The ranch buildings looked small and lonely from this distance, but also somehow right, as if they belonged precisely where they stood. "It's hardscrabble beautiful," Forrest agreed. "Not like the tidy farms back east, but there's something about this country that gets under your skin." They rode for hours, Forrest pointing out landmarks and explaining his plans for the ranch where he wanted to expand grazing, how he was selectively breeding his stock for hardiness and beef quality, the new barn he hoped to build come spring. Florence listened with growing interest, asking questions that seemed to please him with their practicality. At midday, they stopped in a grove of cottonwoods beside the creek. Forrest spread a blanket on the ground and produced a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples from his saddlebags. "This reminds me of picnics my parents used to take us on when I was small," Florence said, biting into a crisp apple, "before my mother died." "You lost her young," Florence nodded. "I was 8. Childbed fever after my brother was born, he died too." She brushed breadcrumbs from her skirt. "My father never remarried, raised me alone. He must be missing you now. He died 3 years ago, heart failure." Florence met Forrest's gaze. "There's no one left for me in Boston, no one who would miss me if I stayed here." The admission hung between them, fraught with meaning. Forrest seemed to understand what it had cost her to say it. "And if you did stay," he asked quietly, "what would you want from this life, from me?" Florence considered her answer carefully. "Respect, kindness, partnership," she hesitated, "and perhaps in time affection." Forrest nodded slowly. "I can promise the first 3 readily enough. The last." He looked away toward the distant mountains. "It's been a long time since I allowed myself to feel much of anything, Florence." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I understand," she said softly. "I'm not asking for promises of undying love, Forrest, only the chance for something real to grow between us." His eyes returned to hers, searching. "That seems fair." On the ride back, Florence found herself studying Forrest with new awareness. The straight line of his shoulders, the way he sat easy in the saddle as if he and the horse were one creature, the profile of his face against the vast blue sky. He wasn't classically handsome, but there was something compelling in his quiet strength, his unflinching honesty. Back at the ranch, he helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment after her feet touched the ground, he didn't release her, and they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Thank you for today," she said, suddenly breathless, "for showing me your world." "Thank you for wanting to see it," he replied, his voice low. That night, Florence sat at the kitchen table with Forrest's ledgers spread before her. She'd offered to review his accounts, and to her surprise, he'd accepted without hesitation. "Your bookkeeping is remarkably thorough," she commented, turning pages of neatly recorded figures. "Many businesses in Boston weren't this well documented. My father insisted on it, said a man should know where every penny comes from and goes to." Forrest sat across from her, mending a bridle by the light of the lamp. "What do you think of our financial position?" Florence appreciated that he asked her opinion directly, without condescension. "Solid, though not extravagant. You've been investing most of your profits back into the herd and land improvements, which is wise for long-term growth." She tapped a column of figures. "These feed costs seem high, though." "Last winter was hard, had to buy extra hay when our own ran short." She nodded, making a note. "Have you considered diversifying, perhaps adding sheep to your operation?" Forrest looked up from his mending, eyebrows raised. "Sheep and cattle don't mix well on the same range, and sheep men aren't popular with cattle ranchers around here." "Not on the same range, no, but that northwest section you showed me today, you said it was too rocky for good grazing. Sheep do well on rougher terrain." She flipped through the ledger. "The wool market is strong right now. It could provide income during seasons when you're not selling cattle." Forrest set aside the bridle, studying her with new respect. "You've given this some thought." "I want to be useful," Florence said simply. Not just in the house, but to the ranch, to our future if I decide to stay. And are you leaning one way or the other on that decision? His tone was carefully neutral, but Florence sensed tension behind the question. She closed the ledger, considering her answer. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival, nearly half of the month Forrest had given her to decide. I am, she said finally, but I'd like a little more time if that's all right. Forrest nodded, accepting this. Of course, the month stands. The next morning at breakfast, Gabriel delivered news from town. A neighbor passing by had mentioned that a traveling show would be performing in Laramie, that Saturday musicians, acrobats, and other entertainments rarely seen in their remote corner of Wyoming. Thought you folks might be interested, Gabriel said, pouring coffee. Been 2 years since anything like this came through. Florence looked hopefully at Forrest, who seemed to be weighing the idea. Would you like to go? He asked her. Very much, she admitted. I've always enjoyed music. Then we'll go. He turned to Gabriel. You'll come too, make a day of it. The older man grinned. Wouldn't miss it, boss. Saturday dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the journey to town. Florence wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the amber in her eyes, and took extra care with her hair, pinning it up in a style more elaborate than her usual practical arrangement. When she came downstairs, she found Forrest waiting in the main room, and for a moment, she didn't recognize him. He'd shaved his usual stubble clean, and instead of his work clothes, he wore a black suit that, while not new, was well tailored to his broad shoulders. His dark hair was neatly combed, the silver at his temples gleaming in the morning light. You look lovely, he said, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. As do you, she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. I've never seen you in a suit before. Haven't had occasion to wear it in some time. He offered his arm. Shall we? In town, the normally quiet Main Street was transformed. Bunting hung from the storefronts, and a stage had been erected in the vacant lot beside the hotel. People from surrounding ranches and farms had come for the entertainment, creating a festive atmosphere Florence hadn't expected in this frontier town. As they made their way toward the gathering crowd, Florence was aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. She caught fragments of conversation. That's the Rivers fellow with his mail-order bride. She's the one they say is bad luck, buried 2 husbands already. Wonder if he knows what he's getting into. Forrest seemed oblivious to the talk, or perhaps simply indifferent to it. He guided Florence to a spot near the stage, nodding to acquaintances but not stopping to chat. Gabriel had wandered off to speak with friends, leaving them alone. The show was better than Florence had dared hope. A quartet of musicians played lively tunes that had the crowd clapping along. Acrobats performed impressive feats of balance and strength. A ventriloquist made children shriek with laughter. For a few hours, Florence forgot the weight of her past, the uncertainty of her future, and simply enjoyed the present moment. During the intermission, Forrest went to buy lemonade from a vendor, leaving Florence alone. She was admiring a display of handcrafted items for sale when she overheard 2 women talking nearby. I wouldn't stand too close to her if I were you, Martha. They say misfortune follows her like a shadow. 2 husbands in the grave before their first anniversaries. If that's not a curse, I don't know what is. Poor Forrest Rivers. Always was a strange one, keeping to himself up at that ranch, but I never thought him a fool. Taking on damaged goods like that, excuse me, Florence interrupted, turning to face the women with as much dignity as she could muster. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about me. The women had the grace to look embarrassed, though not enough to apologize. We meant no offense, Miss Reed, said the older of the 2, a pinch-faced woman in an outdated bonnet. I believe you did, Florence replied calmly, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that you understand something. My husband's died of natural causes and an accident. There was no curse, no mysterious circumstances, just the ordinary tragedies that befall many people. She straightened her shoulders. Mr. Rivers is not a fool for offering me a chance at a new life. He's a man of uncommon decency and courage. The women exchanged glances, clearly unused to being confronted so directly. "Well," huffed the younger woman, "I never is there a problem here?" Forrest had returned, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand, his expression dark as he assessed the situation. "No problem at all," Florence said, taking a glass from him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "These ladies and I were just getting acquainted." The women murmured hasty farewells and retreated, casting backward glances as they went. What was that about? Forrest asked, his eyes following the departing women. "The usual," Florence sighed. "Whispers about my curse, pity for you." Forrest's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have to endure that." "It doesn't matter," Florence said, though in truth, the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "I've heard worse in Boston. It matters to me." His voice was quiet but intense. "You deserve respect, not gossip." Before Florence could respond, the show resumed, but the joy of the day had dimmed for her. She was acutely aware now of the sidelong glances, the whispers, the space that seemed to open around them in the crowd, as if her imagined bad luck might be contagious. After the show, they met Gabriel at the wagon. The old ranch hand took one look at Florence's face and Forrest's thunderous expression, and wisely kept his conversation to the performance they'd just seen. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Thornton from church approached, accompanied by her husband, the town's doctor. "Mr. Rivers, Miss Reed," she greeted them warmly. "We're having a few friends for dinner tomorrow after church. We'd be delighted if you could join us." Florence looked to Forrest, uncertain. He'd been silent and withdrawn since the incident with the gossiping women. "Thank you for the invitation," Forrest said formally, "but we need to return to the ranch directly after service tomorrow." Mrs. Thornton's face fell slightly. "Another time, perhaps." "Perhaps," Forrest agreed noncommittally. As they drove home in the fading light, Florence broke the uncomfortable silence. "You didn't have to decline on my account. If you'd like to attend the Thorntons' dinner." "I declined because I have no desire to sit through an afternoon of polite conversation while people speculate about us behind their napkins," Forrest interrupted, his voice tight. "The Thorntons mean well, but their guests might not." "You can't protect me from gossip forever, Forrest." "No," he agreed, his hands clenched on the reins, "but I can choose not to subject you to it unnecessarily." Florence studied his profile in the deepening twilight. "You're angry." "Yes." The single word held a wealth of emotion. "Because people were talking about me, or about you for choosing me?" Forrest glanced at her, surprise momentarily displacing anger. "About you, of course. I don't give a damn what they say about me." Something warm unfurled in Florence's chest at his immediate, instinctive defense of her. In that moment, she knew with sudden clarity that she wanted to stay, to build a life with this man who cared more for her dignity than for social appearances. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different quality of silence, contemplative rather than strained. When they reached the ranch, Gabriel excused himself to his cabin, leaving Florence and Forrest alone in the yard, the night sky ablaze with stars. "It's so beautiful," Florence murmured, gazing upward. "I've never seen stars like this." "Too much smoke and too many buildings in the cities," Forrest said, following her gaze. "Out here, there's nothing between us and the heavens." "I've made my decision," Florence said suddenly, still looking at the stars. "I want to stay to be your wife." Forrest turned to her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Are you certain? You still have time to consider." "I'm certain." She faced him fully now. "I know it's only been 3 weeks, but I've seen enough to know what kind of man you are. I believe we could build something good together." Forrest was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and took her hand in his. "I would be honored to make you my wife, Florence Reed," he said formally, "but I want you to know something first." He took a deep breath. "I didn't just answer your advertisement because of your honesty. I answered because your history didn't frighten me. I've lived with death's shadow too long to fear it. What I do fear is living half a life, alone with my memories and regrets." His voice softened. "You make me want more than that." The simple honesty of his words moved Florence deeply. Without thinking, she stepped closer and rested her free hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. "I want more too," she whispered. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, Forrest bent his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, almost tentative, but Florence felt it like a promise of comfort, of respect, of the possibility of love. When they parted, Forrest kept her hand in his as they walked toward the house, their shadows merging in the starlight. They were married the following Saturday in the Laramie Church, with Gabriel as witness and Reverend Peterson officiating. Florence wore her blue dress with a posy of late wildflowers Gabriel had gathered for her. Forrest wore his suit, freshly pressed, with a sprig of sage in the lapel. The ceremony was brief and simple, but as Florence spoke her vows, she felt a sense of rightness that had been absent from her previous marriages. This was not a hasty union born of loneliness or social expectation, but a deliberate choice made with clear eyes and hopeful hearts. Few townspeople attended, though Mrs. Thornton came, bringing a small cake as a wedding gift. If others whispered about the unlucky bride and her foolhardy groom, Florence didn't hear them. Her attention was focused entirely on the man beside her, his deep voice steady as he promised to cherish and protect her until death parted them. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other with tender patience. Forrest's calloused hands proved gentle, his reserved nature giving way to unexpected warmth. For Florence, it was a revelation, not just the physical union, but the emotional connection that seemed to grow stronger with each touch, each whispered word. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Forrest's arm around her, Florence felt a peace she had almost forgotten was possible. "I never expected this," she murmured, her head on his chest. "When I placed that advertisement, I hoped for security, perhaps companionship. I didn't dare hope for happiness." Forrest's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "And are you happy, Florence Rivers?" Her new name on his lips made her smile. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." In the months that followed, they built a life together that exceeded Florence's cautious hopes. Forrest proved to be a considerate husband, seeking her opinion on ranch matters, teaching her to ride properly, bringing her books from his infrequent trips to town. Florence threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning to bake in the temperamental wood stove, planting an ambitious garden, even helping with the spring calving when Gabriel fell ill with influenza. To Florence's delight, Forrest took her suggestion about sheep seriously. In March, he purchased a small flock and set them to grazing in the northwest section, just as she had proposed. By summer, the experiment was proving successful enough that he purchased additional breeding stock. "The sheep were your idea," he told her as they recorded the first wool sales in the ledger. "Any profits should be yours to manage." Florence looked up in surprise. "You'd trust me with that much responsibility?" Forrest's expression softened, the way it increasingly did when they were alone. "I trust you with everything I have, Florence, including my heart." It was the closest he had come to a declaration of love. Florence, understanding his reticence with words, heard what remained unspoken and cherished it. As autumn approached, bringing golden light and cooler days, Florence began to suspect a new change in their lives. Her courses, regular as clockwork since girlhood, were late. Her breasts felt tender, and certain smells that had never bothered her before now turned her stomach. She kept her suspicions to herself at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. But by October, a year after she had first received Forrest's letter in Boston, there was no denying her condition. She waited until after dinner one evening when they sat together before the fire, Forrest reading and Florence mending one of his shirts. "Forrest," she said quietly, "I have news." He looked up from his book, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I believe," she paused, gathering courage. "I believe we're going to have a child, in spring." Forrest went utterly still, his book forgotten in his lap. "You're certain?" Florence nodded. "As certain as one can be. I've missed my courses for 3 months now." For a moment Forrest said nothing and Florence felt a flutter of anxiety. They hadn't discussed children directly, though they'd both spoken of them as an eventuality. Then Forrest set aside his book and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. His eyes, when they met hers, were bright with emotion. "A child," he said softly, as if testing the word. "Our child." "Are you pleased?" Florence asked, needing to hear it. In answer, Forrest placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach, his touch reverent. "More than I can say." The tender moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Forrest frowned. Visitors were rare, especially after dark, and went to answer it. Florence heard Gabriel's voice, urgent and low, then Forrest's deeper tones responding. After a moment, Forrest returned to the main room, his expression grave. "There's trouble," he said. "Rustlers hit the Hendersons' place last night, took 20 head and shot their ranch hand when he tried to stop them." Gabriel heard it from a rider passing through. Florence's hand went protectively to her abdomen. "Will they come here?" "I don't know, but we need to be prepared." Forrest went to the gun cabinet and unlocked it, removing his rifle. "I'll take first watch tonight. Gabriel will take second." "What should I do?" Florence asked, rising from her chair. Forrest checked the rifle's action, his movements precise. "Stay inside, keep doors and windows locked." His eyes met hers, serious but not frightened. "If there's trouble, use the pistol in the bedside drawer. You remember how I showed you?" Florence nodded. Earlier that summer, Forrest had insisted on teaching her to shoot, saying a woman alone on a ranch needed to defend herself if necessary. She'd proven to be a decent shot, though the recoil had bruised her shoulder. For 3 nights, Forrest and Gabriel took turns standing watch, but no rustlers appeared. On the 4th day, word came that a posse from Laramie had tracked the thieves into Colorado territory and recovered most of the stolen cattle. The tension eased, but Forrest remained vigilant, checking the herd more frequently and instructing the 2 young hands he'd hired for the winter to be especially alert during night watches. As winter deepened, Florence's pregnancy became visible, her dresses requiring adjustment to accommodate her changing figure. Forrest treated her with increased solicitude, insisting she rest in the afternoons and taking over some of her heavier chores despite her protests. "I'm with child, not invalid," she reminded him after he prevented her from carrying a basket of wood for the fire. "Humor me," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I want both of you healthy." The tenderness of the gesture melted her irritation. Forrest had never been demonstrative in the way her previous husbands had been, but since learning of the pregnancy, he had become more physically affectionate, often resting his hand on her growing belly or kissing her unexpectedly throughout the day. Christmas came with a heavy snowfall that isolated the ranch for nearly a week. Florence had prepared for the holiday, hiding small gifts for Forrest and Gabriel in her trunk and baking special treats with carefully hoarded sugar and dried fruits. On Christmas Eve, they gathered in the main room where Forrest had surprised her by cutting a small pine tree from the foothills and setting it up in the corner. "My mother always insisted on a tree," he explained as Florence exclaimed in delight. "Said it wasn't Christmas without one." They decorated it with paper ornaments Florence had crafted and strings of dried berries and popcorn. Gabriel contributed a carved wooden star for the top, explaining gruffly that he'd been working on it in his spare time. That night, after Gabriel had retired to his cabin with a new scarf Florence had knitted for him and a bottle of good whiskey from Forrest, husband and wife exchanged their own gifts. Florence had made Forrest a new shirt, finer than his everyday work clothes, embroidering the collar and cuffs with a subtle pattern of leaves. "It's beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the stitching. "Too good for ranch work." "That's the idea," Florence smiled. "You need something nice for church and town visits." Forrest's gift to her was a delicate silver locket on a chain. Inside was a tiny daguerreotype of Forrest himself. He'd had it taken on his last trip to Laramie without telling her. "The other side is empty," he explained as she examined it. "I thought when the baby comes." Florence closed her hand around the locket, too moved for words. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him, trying to convey through touch what she couldn't express verbally. Later, as they lay in bed listening to the wind whistling around the eaves, Forrest placed his hand on Florence's rounded belly, his touch gentle. "I never expected this," he said softly. "After the war, after losing my brother and father, I thought I'd live out my days alone on this ranch. I answered your advertisement hoping for a practical arrangement, a household managed, perhaps children someday. I didn't expect." He trailed off, searching for words. "Didn't expect what?" Florence prompted, covering his hand with her own. "Happiness," he said simply. "I didn't expect to be happy again." Florence felt tears prick at her eyes. "Neither did I," she whispered. "After Thomas and James, I thought perhaps I was meant to be alone. That happiness wasn't in my future." Forrest propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her in the dim light of the banked fire. "I need to tell you something, Florence. Something I should have said before now." Her heart quickened. "What is it?" "I love you." The words were simple, direct, like the man himself. "I think I began to love you that first day on the ranch, when you asked about the cattle instead of complaining about the isolation. But I know I love you now, completely." Florence reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines time and hardship had carved there. "And I love you, Forrest Rivers. With my whole heart." He bent to kiss her then, a kiss that sealed their declaration and promised more. In that moment, with snow falling softly outside and warmth surrounding them within, Florence knew that whatever the future held, whatever joy or sorrow awaited them, they would face it together. The baby, a boy they named Thomas Franklin Rivers after Florence's first husband and Forrest's brother, was born on a bright April morning in 1878. The birth was difficult but uncomplicated, with Mrs. Thornton coming out from town to assist. Forrest paced the yard anxiously until Gabriel threatened to tie him to the corral fence if he didn't sit down. When Mrs. Thornton finally called him inside, Forrest found Florence pale but triumphant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he entered, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Forrest approached the bed with something like reverence, perching carefully on its edge and peering at the tiny, red face nestled in the blankets. The baby blinked up at him with unfocused blue eyes, his small fist waving in the air. "He's perfect," Forrest whispered, reaching out one finger to touch the impossibly soft cheek. "Would you like to hold him?" Florence asked. With more fear than he'd felt facing Confederate rifles, Forrest carefully took his son into his arms, marveling at how light yet substantial he felt. The baby yawned, then settled against his father's chest with a small sigh. "Hello, Thomas," Forrest said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome to the world." As spring turned to summer, Thomas thrived, growing rapidly and developing a sunny disposition that charmed everyone, even the most taciturn of the ranch hands. Florence recovered her strength quickly and soon was back to her usual activities, though now with a baby often balanced on her hip or sleeping nearby in a cradle Forrest had crafted during the winter months. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier but more joyful than before. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, with the sheep experiment proving so successful that Forrest expanded the flock and hired a dedicated shepherd. The cattle herd grew as well, with Forrest's careful breeding program producing calves that fetched premium prices at market. In town, attitudes toward Florence gradually shifted. It was hard to maintain belief in a curse when faced with such evident happiness and prosperity. The birth of a healthy child seemed to put the final nail in the coffin of the unlucky bride rumors. Even Mrs. Caldwell, who had been among the most vociferous gossips, grudgingly admitted that Florence Rivers seemed to have put her tragic past behind her. One warm evening in late summer, as Florence sat on the porch nursing Thomas while Forrest mended tack beside her, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here from grieving widow in Boston to contented wife and mother in Wyoming. "What are you thinking?" Forrest asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. About luck, she replied. Good and bad, how people are so quick to assign meaning to random events. Forrest set aside his work. Like your supposed curse, Florence nodded. 2 deaths were enough to label me unlucky, dangerous even. As if grief were contagious. She looked down at Thomas, now sleeping peacefully against her breast. But look at what came from my decision to leave that behind to risk being called foolish or desperate. Look at what we've built together. Forrest reached over to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch tender. I never believed in luck, good or bad. I believe in choices and their consequences. You chose courage when you came west. I chose trust when I answered your advertisement. Everything good we have flows from those choices. Florence leaned into his touch, grateful beyond words for this man who had seen past her history to the woman she truly was. I used to pray for luck to change, she said quietly. Now I just give thanks for the life we have. As the years passed, the Rivers Ranch grew into one of the most prosperous in the county. Florence and Forrest welcomed 2 more children, a daughter, Sarah, born in 1880, and another son, James, in 1883. Thomas grew into a thoughtful boy with his father's quiet manner and his mother's amber eyes. He took to ranch life naturally, showing an affinity for horses that reminded Forrest poignantly of his brother. Florence never forgot the journey that had brought her to this life, the deaths that had shaped her, the courage it had taken to start again, the whispers that had followed her. But as she watched her children playing in the yard, Forrest working with the horses in the corral, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, she knew that what others had called bad luck had, in the end, led her exactly where she was meant to be. And Forrest, who had once been called a fool for marrying a woman with such a tragic history, would say to anyone who asked that it was the wisest choice he'd ever made, not because he didn't believe in her supposed curse, but because he believed in her. In 1898, 20 years after they first met, Florence and Forrest stood together at the Laramie train station, seeing Thomas off to college in Denver. As the train pulled away, Forrest wrapped his arm around his wife's waist. "Did you ever imagine this that day you stepped off the train?" he asked. Florence leaned into his embrace, watching the train until it disappeared around a bend. "Never," she admitted. "I hoped for safety, for a place to belong. I never dared dream of such happiness." Forrest pressed a kiss to her temple, now showing strands of silver among the chestnut. "You were never unlucky, Florence Rivers. You were simply waiting for the right life to find you." Hand in hand, they walked back to their wagon, ready to return to the ranch, to their remaining children, to the life they had built together, a life founded not on luck or superstition, but on courage, respect, and a love that had grown deeper with each passing year.